Well, let me officially welcome everybody to this new semester of the Monash Social Contract Research Network seminar. We've got three seminars coming up this semester, and I'm particularly delighted to be able to introduce the first of them this evening, not least because the presenter is a colleague of mine at Monash University. Dr. Sandra Leonie Field is a lecturer in philosophy. Her research topics include early modern European political philosophy, democratic theory, and concepts of power. She's also written on non-Western philosophy as well. Perhaps most pertinently for today's talk, she's the author of Potentia, Hobbes and Spinoza on Power and Popular Politics, that came out with Oxford University Press in 2020. And her title for this evening's talk, this evening in Melbourne at least, is Spinoza and the Social Contract. So please do join with me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Leonie Field.
Thanks very much for welcoming me, and thank you, Chris, for having me along in your series. I've been aware of your series for some time, so it's a great honour to be a part of it. Let me just get my slides up. Wait 1 second. Here we are. Okay, that's good. My screen froze a moment ago, and I think that might be at my end. So if that's an ongoing problem, I can switch to tethering via my phone. So do let me know. But at the moment, it looks fine. So Chris, just sort of wave at me if there's an issue with that, and we can try an alternative way of linking. Okay, Spinoza and the Social Contract. So for this talk, my own research focus has been on the political philosophy of Spinoza and Hobbes, and in particular how I try to do my darndest to do the proper exegetical work. But I'm also driven by interest in contemporary political philosophy. Now, social contract per se has not been my focus. And so, but it's an obvious entry point to think about understanding Spinoza's political philosophy. And I think that his take on the social contract is super interesting. So I sort of grabbed the opportunity to be part of this seminar series to try to reframe work that I've been doing in another lens, but to try to now put it through the lens of social contract theory. And that may be, I feel like Spinoza's political philosophy is not particularly well known, and this might be a bit of a nice entry point for people to bridge from things that are more familiar. So here's the plan of my talk. I'll try to keep an eye on the time here. So I'm going to give, presuming that Spinoza is not as familiar to folks as other authors, I will give a bit of background and context, intellectual and historical. Then I will, to understand Spinoza and social contract, we will be thinking of Spinoza as a reader of Hobbes, because his political philosophy is very closely engaged with Hobbes, and Hobbes is a massive social contract theorist. And when we see what Spinoza does with Hobbes's philosophy, then I'll raise the question of whether this means he's a radical social contract theorist, or is he a critic of social contract theory? And those two things might be a bit proximate, but maybe we we'll try to push which is the better description. And then I'll very briefly sketch what I see the interest of this to be moving forwards. Okay, so that's a portrait of Spinoza. So Spinoza, he died very young, hence the rather beautiful portrait. There aren't any portraits of an old man because he died, right? So 1632 to 1677. If any of us measure our own productivity by age 45 against these standards, it can be a bit of a bit chastening. So I put two names there, Baruch or Benedictus. So Spinoza was Iberian Jew, a Jewish family in the Netherlands. So he was originally Baruch, which is Hebrew for blessed, but then he famously was excommunicated from the Jewish community, at which point he took up the Latin corresponding name Benedictus to Spinoza. So Spinoza is best known, I think, in the kind of scholarly circles that I inhabit as a metaphysical philosopher. He's a core commentator on Descartes. And if you have a classic old school undergraduate history of philosophy course, you'll have a course on the rationalists. And the rationalists are Spinoza and Descartes and Leibniz. So he's one of these big three metaphysical philosophers. And the basis for his being put in these big three is primarily his major work, The Ethics, which despite its title is heavily metaphysical, and often it's taught really focusing on the first part of the metaphysics, which is takes Cartesian metaphysics and makes a bold twist. Now you'll see on the right, I've got a picture. This is a statue of Spinoza, which I believe was put up in about 2008 in Amsterdam. And you'll see that it's got two features that are kind of interesting. One is this weird geometrical object in front. And then Spinoza himself has a jacket that seems to have a lot of birds on it. So what's going on there? So one of his bold claim was where Descartes thought each soul is a substance and God is a substance and matter is a substance. Spinoza says, no, there's only one substance, which is we can either call God or we can call nature, and we're all just parts of it. So there he is, his coat is like the one substance, which is all of nature. It's got all the bits in it. He also tried to explain his thing through geometrical method, hence the geometrical shape there. So much for the common entry point, I think, into undergraduate studies of knowing about Spinoza. The thing is, unlike Descartes, Spinoza actually had a much wider range of what I call social interests. He writes on not just on ethics, but also on political philosophy, on religion, on biblical toleration. So you'll see at the bottom of the statue, I don't know any Dutch, but I think that's half of a sentence saying the point of the purpose of the state is freedom. And so he's got major contributions here, which I think are less familiar within the standard things that we teach at an undergraduate level. But I think it's super interesting. I think there's been some rise in interest in Spinoza's political philosophy over the past, 40 years or so. It's quite contested. In Europe, a lot of Marxists or ex-Marxists jumped to Spinoza for various reasons. He seemed to offer something that seemed to offer something a bit compatible with some sort of materialism, but without the big world historical teleology towards communism. I think he's become, there's this perennial interest in Hobbes, in more Anglophone scholarship, and I think Spinoza's distinctive twist on Hobbes has maybe been the entry point there. But this is just to sort of sketch him, to situate him a little bit for you. So you'll see I've listed, as well as his major work, The Ethics, we also have the Theological Political Treatise and the Political Treatise. Not very nifty names, but there they are. The Political Treatise was incomplete, so he died as he was writing the final chapter. The Theological Political Treatise was viewed as highly incendiary and was published under a false name. It was the only thing of his that was actually published during his lifetime. Okay, so that's the sort of encyclopedia entry stuff. Let me give you a little bit more of the context. So Spinoza is living in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. So quick primer, I'm sure I'm worse on this than other people in this room, but the Dutch provinces cast off Spanish imperial rule only in 1579. So this is less than 100 years before Spinoza is born. And then the Dutch Republic emerged after that, not with particular careful design or rational principles, but just kind of how it fell out. So combining, you'll see from this map that it's very divided by water and there's many different provinces, and the Dutch Republic was the combination of these provinces. And there's a fair degree of regional diversity and regional autonomy. Holland is the most prominent of the provinces. I think it's the one which is mainly yellow and sort of to the center of the map. And over the century since the Spaniards left, there were various struggles to establish what shape self-rule was going to take. And that involves both trying to establish self-rule, but also there's a lot of traditional regional privileges which are being maintained. Okay. The other big factor of this context that Spinoza is writing in is that the Dutch Republic in this time, particularly Holland, was an incredible commercial hub for trade around the entire world. And correspondingly, it had a very diverse urban population. So Spinoza's father was a converso Jew. So they dropped Judaism in order to avoid the Inquisition. They were fruit traders with links to wherever they got their dried fruit from. And so you have this very complex social domain where you have social divisions between old aristocratic monarchical types and bourgeois republicans. Then you also have religious divisions between Calvinists and all sorts of diverse other Protestant sects. Okay. The other factor that is relevant here, I think, is that the Dutch Republic is just across the water from England, and at this time, England is going through its civil war, and Dutch society is very much involved. You see how close together they are. So, the future King of England was a Dutch member of the House of Orange. The Levellers from England are in exile in Holland. So different parts of Dutch society are aligned with and very involved in the struggles in England of the time. And there's Cromwell apparently even proposed at some point unifying England and the Dutch Republic, and then there was a war over various trade rules. So they're very closely in line. So I'm going to draw together the salience of all of these historical points, but I think understanding the complexity of the political situation might give a little bit of context for the kind of complexity of the political philosophy that we see coming out of it. Okay, so I've called it the Dutch Republic. They had no king, but it was unified by this quasi-monarchical ducal figure, the stadtholder from the House of Orange. And this is the same house that subsequently provided the next English king. At the same time as these quasi-monarchical figures, there were also these bourgeois administrators, these regents, pensionaries of each province, and then they had a grand pensionary across all of the provinces together. And so there was conflict through the 17th century between the House of Orange and the bourgeois pensionaries. And so it's very complex. So they're both the kind of elite, but they're fighting against each other. The society as a commercial society is rather more equal than other more feudal societies in Europe at the time, but there's no clean sense of we the people. The more rural Calvinist populations are aligning with the Orangists, but then the urban masses are a bit more religiously diverse and they align with the bourgeois. So it's very messy. There's no sort of unified voice of the people. That's all of those dimensions across the fact that then there's also these many provinces. Things were not going well through the time that Spinoza was writing. So the tensions between the bourgeois pensionaries and the semi-monarchical House of Orange were pushing back and forth over this period. There was no stadtholder at all during the middle bit of Spinoza writing, but then the Oranges pressed back under the leadership of William III, the future King of England, and the Republican regent leaders were lynched. Here's a nice image of them being lynched. These are Spinoza's friends, Spinoza's personal friends, Jan de Witt and his brother, whose name escapes me. And so the closest you don't have sometimes when we think of social contract theory, we think of the people coming together and saying what their voice is. You don't really have a clear voice of the people. To the closest you get to the voice of the people is them lynching one set of political leaders. And so we have a little bit of a hesitation already to understand what, to think in some sort of simple terms of the people coming together and agreeing upon something. Okay, intellectual context now. So that's my historical political context. So, I mean, I'm not much of a proper historian, right? I do texts and concepts. So this is me sketching on the basis of other people's work. It's a little bit more speculative. I think the things that I find it helpful to have that as a background, but I defer to other people more historically informed than me. The thing that I really think I can bring is a bit of the conceptual, try to push on some conceptual points that I think are interesting. But just one more bit of context before we get there. So what is the intellectual context? I've told you the political context, that's the intellectual context. These two guys, everybody should know who these are. This is Hobbes on the left and Machiavelli on the right. So the intellectual currents in the Dutch Republic at the time, there's a lot of Cartesianism coming in philosophically, but politically, the thought of Hobbes is coming in quite strongly. And the Dutch Republic is actually a centre for Hobbes's thought making its way into Europe, being translated into Latin, or the Latin text being published there, and from there in through the rest of Europe. And so Hobbes is offering this kind of science of politics, this very foundational approach. And Hobbes, was in fact got his things published in Amsterdam, and he couldn't publish them in England. At the same time, there's also biblical political theory going on. A lot of the Dutch Republic at the time, because they were these different provinces trying to understand how they were related together, they were very interested in Petrus Cornelius, who tells the history of the Hebrew Republic, because they were the ancient tribes of Israel, were also a number of different tribes kind of federated together. So that's another influence. But the other one, I think, was really important in this period in the Dutch Republic is Machiavelli and also Tacitus, where you have this complex de facto approach to politics, sort of almost in some ways the opposite of Hobbes. Rather than trying to get pure, clean scientific principles of politics, you have this very engaged what actually has worked historically in the real world and how does power work in the real world. So this is our context. Okay. So now let me jump in a little bit more sort of conceptually. So the way I want to enter into talking about social contract is to put Spinoza next to Hobbes. Now, you may not be so familiar with this picture on the right. The next slide I'll show you is this Leviathan cover may be familiar. So Hobbes wrote his political philosophy multiple times, basically the same thing multiple times. And, it changes a little bit along the way, but the one we know best is the big English one called Leviathan, but the one that was best known on the continent was De Cive, which means of the citizen. And this is one of the covers of De Cive. And so I just have it in the background there while I just give the quick rundown of Hobbes's political philosophy, because I think these covers are supposed to speak many words, and I think that they kind of do. So I'm just going to move my little Zoom gallery out of the way so I can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so for Hobbes, we have to understand how a political regime works, how a political state works. We have to think of what it's made out of, how it's generated, or how it could be generated, even if it wasn't in fact generated that way. This is a method they also used in mathematics as well. To understand a circle, you have to know how it could have, in principle, how it could have been made. Even if I traced around a milk lid, it could have been made with a compass that makes it equidistant from the circle. So here we have this idea, how to understand a state. We understand how it could have been made out of its components. What are its components? Bare human beings. So the idea is, if you just take human beings who are not in some sort of political relation, and Tom Corbin, I want to defer to his great Hobbes expertise as well, whether he's in the audience here. So you have, in a state of nature where you don't have some political relation of authority, Hobbes wants to say you have a right to defend yourself as you see fit, because for goodness sake, if you don't do it, who's going to, right? You can't be asked to reserve, to exercise some moral self-control when there's no guarantee you're not just going to get killed for it. But the result is, as everybody is competing, is everybody's not sure whether somebody else is out to get them, and everybody else is worried about people like disrespecting them, you end up with a life that an anarchic and hostile situation. So you'll see on the bottom right of this picture, you'll see naked people running and shooting at each other and clubbing at each other with clubs and looking very unhappy. For what it's worth, I mean, Hobbes has chosen to illustrate that by reference to the state of the Americas. It goes without saying that the actual social organization of the Americas bears no particular relation to this English fantasy of that particular time, but it serves his point to talk about this is his imagination of what life is like without a political order. So they say, if you really want liberty, this is what liberty looks like. If you have no order over you, you're all shooting each other. And in the famous words of his later work, Leviathan, life is brutish, nasty, and short. And the solution instead is you hand over your natural right to do as you please, to protect yourself, to a sovereign who will speak with one voice on behalf and keep everybody in line. Now, on the cover of De Cive, you'll see that that's Imperium on the left. Look how it's very orderly and everybody's extremely happy on the bottom left there. So if you, oops, sorry, I just got to, let's see, where's my button to, there we are. Okay, so the later version of his text was Leviathan, and here we see his picture of a different picture of how this happens. You'll see the big Leviathan, the sovereign, the ruler at the top with his big sword, and you'll see there's all the symbols of how he's actually unified church and political power, but that's not my purpose today so much. You'll see his chainmail is actually made out of tiny people. So the idea is the strength of the sovereign is made out of the people, because they hand over their right, and through handing over their right, they constitute this ruler. Now, a couple of features that are important and probably familiar to you, for Hobbes, you must hand over you don't retain any right. You don't retain any of your right at all when you set up the sovereign. Why is you don't put it, you can't say, oh, you can be sovereign over us on condition that you're nice and don't abuse your power. Why not? That seems like an obvious condition to put on it. So Hobbes has thought if there's a problem of highest authority, if you put a constraint on the sovereign's power, then if you and the sovereign disagree, there's no higher power over both of you to decide this dispute, and you end up fighting again. So the whole point was to avoid fighting. So if you want to avoid fighting, you have to have some ultimate point, unconditional point of authority. And so the sovereign could be a single person, or it could be an aristocratic assembly, it could be a democratic assembly, but whichever one it is, it has to have the highest authority. And Hobbes imagines what his critics subsequently actually said. He says, wouldn't this sovereign who's unconstrained do terrible things? Why wouldn't it be a terrible ruler? And Hobbes says, well, first it has no incentive to, it'll be its own interest to have happy subjects because then everything's more prosperous. And secondly, even if the sovereign is terrible, it's better than civil war. So suck it up, basically. And so so this is my quick sketch of Hobbesian political philosophy, which I think is probably familiar, but I just wanted to lay it out there to make sure we're all starting on the same page. The critical thing is we have a cut between a state of nature in which everybody has right to maintain themselves, and then a civil order where you have zero rights retained naturally, and and this is a condition of civil right, you might say, and basically everything's at the grace of the sovereign. So far, so familiar. Now, let's see what Hobbes does. Remember, Hobbes actually owns De Cive. It's unclear whether he had access to Leviathan, but he probably did. His friends were involved in translating it into Dutch and also involved in publishing it in Latin. So let's see. I'm just putting some passages next to each other. So we've got something pretty similar. In chapter 16, so the first bit of Spinoza's theological political treatise is a whole lot of biblical exegesis, which is super interesting in its own way, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And so chapter 16 is when he finally settles down to politics per se. And in chapter 16, it looks pretty Hobbesian, right? So Hobbes is on the left here and Spinoza's on the right. So Hobbes says, in state of nature, you've got a right to all things. Every man was permitted to do anything to anybody to enjoy whatever he wanted and whatever he could get. And you see, Spinoza says something very similar. The right and established practice of nature under which all are born and for the most part live prohibits nothing except what no one desires and no one can do. It doesn't prohibit disputes, anger, deception without qualification. It's not averse to anything, appetite, urges. So far, so Hobbesian. Okay. And then we also have a movement for similar Hobbesian reasons, we have a movement to establishing a state. So here's Hobbes. Hobbes says they submit all their wills to the will of one man or assembly, and that obliges them not to resist the will of the assembly, and not to withhold the use of his strength against others. So that you have to, if the sovereign says, "Hey, can you go enforce my punishment on that other guy?" You got to do it, right? Got to do whatever they say. You see, Spinoza says something very similar. This is the way social order can be formed. Each person transfers all the power he has to the social order, which alone will retain the supreme right of nature over all things. The social order alone will have sovereignty, and each person will be bound to obey it. Okay. Sounds the same, right? Pretty much the same. So this could, and sometimes he's been viewed just as a eccentric Hobbesian. But let's look at the eccentricity. There's many interesting differences the more you dig, but the difference that has drawn a lot of attention, that Spinoza himself draws attention to, and that I'm going to draw attention to, is his definition of right. Okay, so Hobbes understands rights are what I'm going to call juridical permissions to exercise power. They're in that order of permissibility or not. That's what it means to articulate a right. It's not saying what you actually do. It's the modality is different there. And so, and specifically, how do we determine what the right is? It's defined in terms of, he does it a bit differently in different texts, but more or less, we look to reason to tell us what rights different people have. And so people may act in ways which they don't have the right to act in. That's the critical thing. They can act in ways which they don't have the right to act. And, somebody else could have some different view of reason which would cut them up differently. But for Hobbes, reason says when there's no sovereign, you have a right to do whatever you like. And but reason also says that you should institute a sovereign. And when you do, you have zero rights left. Okay. Spinoza says right is coextensive with power. He says this a few different ways in a few different passages, but there's some sort of flattening out of what you have the right to do onto what you have the power to do, which is also flattened onto what you actually do. Each individual has a supreme right to do everything it can, or the right of each thing extends as far as determinate power. So if you in fact do something, that means you have the power to do it because you did it, and that means you have the right to do it. And so I've got this nice image here to help you sort of get your head around this. This is by some Dutch master, I forgot the name. But you see, the one example that Spinoza gives to help us think through what the right coextensive with power means is the big fish eat the little ones, and the big fish have the right to eat the little ones because they do it, because they have the power to do it. And so you might have thought that this is just some, Thrasymachiean might makes right. It's actually a little bit more interesting than that, because it's not just saying those ones that we put in the class of strong have a right to do whatever they like to those ones we put in the class of weak. That would be one view, but that's a bit simpler than Spinoza's view. Spinoza's view is if in fact you don't manage to do something, that means you lack the power to do it, which means you lack the right. So if that fish didn't manage to eat some little fish, that means it didn't have the power to do it. It means that the little fish had the right not to be eaten by the fact that they didn't get eaten. So it goes both ways. It's very curious because it seems like we're almost losing what the whole point of a language of right is normally supposed to do, which is supposed to demarcate something which tells you what you're allowed to do or not, separate from what you might actually do. We seem to be losing that. Let's see where this goes. And so the interesting thing is, so we had those passages before. It looks very Hobbesian. So it's true. He says, look, in nature, you have right to do whatever you like. Then there's this thing called a social contract where you hand over your right. But the critical thing is it can't just be words. The power has to be reorganized or handed over at the same time. So what a social contract is a reorganizing of relations of power. Let me see if I got, okay. And so this is a famous quote. I'll sort of sit on this point for a minute. This is a famous quote from Spinoza's correspondence, where he says, as far as politics is concerned, the difference you asked about between Hobbes and me is this. I always preserve natural right unimpaired, and I maintain that in each state, the supreme magistrate, the sovereign, has no more right over its subjects than it has greater power over them. Okay. So what's the difference here? So remember this double-edged sword of making right flatten onto power. In order to say that the sovereign has a right to do something, it's not just that it's promised that it's allowed to do something, that people have promised to obey it when it does something, or that it's stipulated that it's permissible to do something. In order for a sovereign to have a certain right, and the Latin for sovereign is highest authority. In order for it to have that highest authority, it has to actually amount to having the power corresponding to that. It has to be efficacious. Okay. And so what does this mean? For Spinoza, having laid out a very Hobbesian view of politics and of the social contract in chapter 16 of TTP, he takes it back in chapter 17. So here's how it goes. So he says, so Hobbes says, right to this juridical permission to exercise power. And he says, reason recommends you fully transfer your right to the sovereign. And once you've done that, reason tells you you promised to obey. You have no right left to complain. Now, for Spinoza, right is not a juridical permission, it's coextensive with power. And so there can be such thing as a transfer of right, but what that means, it has to be some efficacious change so that you are finding yourself doing what the sovereign wants. And there's also ways that can come about, right? If you're frightened of the sovereign's punishment, that's one way. If you want to please us, or any number of things might lead to that situation of the sovereign having this right and power over you. But Spinoza thinks there's going to be a limit. In theory, you could transfer all right and power, but in practice, no one can transfer all the right and power without limit, because the power remains somehow physically located in your body, and some commands are just not going to be carried out. And so in chapter 17, he says, no one will, he says, this applies, Hobbesian theory applies more in theory than in practice. In practice, no one will ever be able to transfer his power or consequently his right in such a way that he ceases to be a man. So the sovereign can't absolutely hold right. And so Spinoza observes that sovereigns have been historically more troubled by internal dissent than by external enemies. There's nothing gained by insisting on the juridical standard of Hobbesian absoluteness if you can't actually get it in practice working. Okay. So let me just keep an eye on the time. Whoa, I better get going a bit faster here. Okay, so Spinoza is a radical contract theorist. Let's see what the upshot is here. So in chapter 20 of the Theological Political Treatise, he spells out what limits in particular he's interested in. Okay, so he says, these are a couple of things that by a Hobbesian theory, the sovereign would have right to do, but by Spinoza's theory, the sovereign does not have a right to do. Rule with utmost violence, command men's minds, make men say nothing but what they prescribe. So the thought and the speech is really something she really goes into quite a lot. And so the idea is the sovereign doesn't have the power to make people do these things, therefore they don't have the right. Now, if you're concentrating, you might think, wait a minute, I just told you before that if somebody manages to do something, that means they have the power to do something. You might think, well, okay, maybe you can't perfectly command men's minds, and maybe you can't perfectly make people say nothing but what you prescribe, but you can do it to some degree, right? You know, there's also sorts of ways in which people have shaped people's ways of thinking and have actually constrained speech quite a lot. And so what's going on here? It seems like Spinoza started off very strict with the right and coextensive with power, and now something a bit looser is going on. And so actually Spinoza himself, he notices, he says, look, you can govern thoughts and speech to some degree, and actually seditious speech is a real problem, and so it's going to be legitimate to regulate it to some degree. He thinks it's a good idea. So that's what's going on here. And I think the clue is in this first one about ruling with utmost violence. You know, it's not that nobody has ever ruled with utmost violence. When people actually rule with utmost violence, because they did it, they count as having the right to do it. But what you'll see is, I think the idea that he has in TTP is that it's a bit self-defeating, right? So there's this Seneca quote, tyrants never rule for long. And so it's kind of, strictly speaking, for the moment that a ruler does it, they do have the right to do it. But you can sort of say a bit more loosely, they don't have the right to do it because they undermine themselves pretty quickly if they rule with utmost violence. Okay. And so I think some similar thought is going on when he talks about free speech. He says, look, on the one hand, you can't perfectly command people's minds or make people say nothing but what you prescribe, but you can kind of do it. But when you do it, he's got this interesting discussion of how the more you regulate people's speech, the more you're going to have, that's going to be most effective on the servile sycophants and the least effective on the civically minded citizens who think they've got some useful criticism to give to you. So the more authorities try to take away freedom of speech, the more stubbornly men will resist, not the greedy or the flatterers, but the people of integrity and virtue. men are constituted, they endure nothing with greater impatience than the opinions they believe to be true should be considered criminal, and that what moves them to piety should be counted as wickedness. So he has this idea that, look, okay, you can regulate it quite a bit, but gee, it ruins things if you do it. And then he thinks, well, maybe this is going to give the downfall of the republic. So maybe you don't really have the right to do it. I sometimes think that having spent a lot of time in both Singapore and in Monash, sometimes I really I sort of feel this a little bit about not being able to speak, makes people who are trying to do good things get very angry and hostile. Okay, so the overall lesson from Spinoza's social contract is you kind of need, it's like, okay, talk about the social contract, but we really need to talk about what works. There's going to be concrete limits to the extent of sovereign power. Like later on, he has this quote in a different text where he says, having the right to do what you like say I've got the right to do what I like with the table, doesn't mean I have a right to make the table eat grass, right? And so similarly, I have a right to rule over people, but it depends what I can actually get them to do, right? They're really limited by what I can get them to do. And so you might frame Spinoza as a radical contractarian. You can say we can think about a contract setting up a state, but when we think of the handover of right, we only can say that the right has truly been handed over when the power is also established. And so you have to think about what forms of demands of obedience and conduct from your citizenry you can actually be sustained. And if you can't sustain them, if you can't get people to come on board and obey, then then that shows a weakness of your right. Okay. And he has these general arguments that he thinks that democracy will generally do better because it generally fits a little bit better. It doesn't demand quite so much alienation from what you can coax people to do. This is sometimes described as a non-juridical approach to the social contract. And so the interesting upshot of all this is that where other contract theorists sometimes try to limit government power or sovereign power, where they focus on putting explicit conditions on what's permissible and not permissible for a ruler to ask, for Spinoza, he says it doesn't matter the official conditions or what the official agreement is. What matters is what people are going to do. And so in particular, he's interested in moments of popular indignation, which can lead people to rise up against a technically like a Hobbesian rightful regime. People might rise up if people are indignant. It doesn't matter if they're supposed to be going along with things. If they're outraged by it and they're rising up against it, then you say the regime doesn't have the right that it thought it did. And this maybe accounts for why certain sort of post-Marxist kind of thinkers, particularly in European language traditions, have been extremely interested in Spinoza. Because remember, for Marx, he's suspicious of official juridical accounts of right because he thinks they're quite often ideological impositions to maintain ruling class power. Spinoza doesn't really talk in terms of class like that, but he does have this idea that just saying things and coming up with some elaborate account of what counts as reasonable and having right is not going to cut it. We're always interested in popular indignation, even if it's technically illegal. Okay, so let me move on to, that was presenting Spinoza as a radical social contract theorist. Now I want to present Spinoza as a critic of social contract theory. So, I suppose a radical theorist is already kind of like a critical theorist in the sense, like the Marxists, that they're skeptical of official accounts of promises founding things. I suppose if I think of social contract theory is about promises and agreements founding legitimacy. So already what I've told you about Spinoza, you can see he's a bit skeptical about that. But I think, social contract theory is a broad church. What I've described so far, he's within that broad church, although he's a pretty idiosyncratic social contract theorist. But the thing is, you might remember that I said Spinoza wrote 2 political texts, not 1. The later text, unfortunately, the names are very similar, right? So the first one is called the Theological Political Treatise, and the latter one is called the Political Treatise. Or sometimes just say TP as opposed to TTP. The later one is the TP. So the Political Treatise, the curious thing about this later text is the contract kind of disappears. And even natural right, this idea of individuals with natural right kind of disappears. Interesting, right? If those were the two things that tethered him to the social contract tradition, these two things drop out in the second text. And so I couldn't find a perfect quote to. So in the first chapter, he starts off the whole text by saying, "Look, people have always lived together in society. People are so constituted they can't live without some common laws." So he's sort of almost refusing from the outset to explore what people would be like without society. He says people always are in society, and the goal of political philosophy is to explore the ways that it can be arranged. So already the hostility towards that idea of a pre-social human being. That's on the left. On the right, this is a bit more of a complicated point. Remember, social contract theorists Hobbes and early Spinoza they talk about, here's this individual and they have this right of nature, and then let's see what happened when they agree to come together. But in the political treatise, just a minute. He seems to say that an individual natural right can't be conceived prior to actually being in society. What does this mean? So his starting point, I suppose, is that, in the text, he doesn't start off by talking about isolated individuals. The first thing he talks about when he talks about right and power is about subjection, or at best, interdependence. He says, before he comes to talking about, rather than saying independence is the starting point, then how do people get into relations of authority? He starts off by saying, first of all, we are always find ourselves under the power of others. So, he lists like 5 different ways it could be. You might be under the power of another because you're tied up, or because you don't have any means of defense against them, or because you fear them, or because you hope for benefit from them, or because you defer to their judgment. So the whole range of human interactions, he says, in all these cases, you're not standing as independent. You're actually, the starting point is you're already in some sort of subordinate relations to other, or dependent upon other people. The only time when you are your own master, this Latin term sui juris, is when you have this rare and difficult mastery of reason, where you're not afraid of other people, you're not dependent on other people, and you're not dependent on their judgment. So the default thing is being under another's power, and the independence is only achievement. And in fact, he says this independence is not achievable in the state of nature. The only possible chance you have of not finding yourself subjected to others is in a civil order. And so this is the quote I have here: "The right of nature can hardly be conceived except where men have common rights and jointly able to claim for themselves land they can inhabit, cultivate, are able to protect themselves, fend off force, live according to common opinion, all." So he says the only condition where you're not subjected to other people is when you have all these things in place, and that is nothing other than already being in society. Okay, so left and right of this page is supposed to show 2 things already that I'm suggesting show the political treatise is kind of rejecting the starting point of the social contract theorist. But you might think, oh, come on, surely this is still compatible. No social contract theorist actually thinks that people lived in real life separate from another. It's just a model, right? So surely nobody's saying the state of nature actually exists. Well, maybe some people are, but most of them aren't, right? And so you might think neither of these things push Spinoza out as outside of the social contract tradition. But actually, I think they kind of do. And let me try to explain why. So if the big and diverse tradition, which is the social contract tradition, try to make a generalization here. I don't know whether you'll agree. It seems to me that the key thing is understanding the state by thinking of like individuals and combining them together. And so it's like, the point of a social contract is you take individuals, and from their agreement, you come to think about the legitimacy of the state. But what these passages in Spinoza's political treatise are trying to say is you don't even have a standard of who people are. You can't abstract away to find out who people are or what they want. You can't abstract away from the fact of them, from who they are in social orders. There is no defined person outside of the social order. And you might think I'm being a bit speculative here, but there's this nice phrase which I quite like. I think it's on this. Here we are. So he has a lot of these passages, which I think are common to other thinkers in maybe this broadly Republican tradition, early modern tradition, is they have this constant thing where they say the virtue of the people is due to the laws. Now, laws here doesn't mean law in a narrow modern sense. Law means like the basic constitutional structures of society, right? I don't know, the rules and basic structure of society. The virtue of people is due to the laws. And so the idea is that to understand how people feel, what their affects are, what their desires are, how they think about stuff, that is something that is produced by the particular social order they live in. And if you grow up in a different social order, you're going to have different desires, passions, preferences, and so on. So here we are, that on the left, we should impute rebellions, wars, not to the wickedness of subjects, as to corruption of the state. Men aren't born civil, they become civil. So it's the state that tells you who people are, that makes them who they are. And so on the right, I've got a different one here, which is people's virtue and observance of the laws are attributed to the Commonwealth. So we understand who people are and how they behave in terms of the context they live in. So we have this kind of, you can't justify, like if the social order is what tells people, it makes people who they are, you can't use what people think about stuff to justify the social order, because that's what they think about stuff is a product of the social order. And so you already see some hints about this in TTP, which is the earlier text, where he says that, let me see, I don't know if I've got a quote on this. Yes, here we are. He says that passions and beliefs are to a large part due to the state. So here we are. Though hearts cannot be commanded in the same way tongues can, still hearts are to some extent under the control of the supreme power, which can bring it about in many ways that most people believe, love, hate, whatever it wants them to. So in the TTP, this is presented as very intentional and commanded, whereas I think in the political treatise, it's a bit more of a diffuse sense of this is just what emerges in a social order. Particular kinds of subjects emerge in a social order. And so what I've got on the left there is a picture of Petrus Kanaeus's History of the Hebrew Republic, because this is the quote on the right is in the context of Spinoza discussing the Hebrew Republic. And the Hebrew Republic is interesting because on the one hand, it starts with the contract of God with the peoples of Israel mediated via Moses. But what happens in Spinoza's discussion, this is often dismissed as the boring bit of TTP, at least Antonio Negri famously says it's the boring bit and just skips through it. The interesting thing here is that after this contract, the contract kind of disappears a little bit. It goes into the background. The thing that's really doing the work for Spinoza in the Hebrew Republic is the way that the social order organized the Hebrew people and generated in them certain attitudes, passions, preferences, made them very fiercely loyal and pious through particular features of land tenure and how they organized festivals and how they did the Jubilee and all things like this. Okay. So, yeah, okay. And you see, so this general theme that I'm trying to draw out, which I see in Spinoza, is this idea that you kind of want to do a social contract where here's the people, let's ask what they want, that gives us what they can agree to, that tells us what the social order can be. But the problem is if you think that a social order is kind of constitutive or transformative of how people behave, then it's hard to get that. How can you ask those people before they're in the social order what social order should be when their character is changed by the social order? You see something similar in Rousseau, where Rousseau says we need a social contract, but he says you only become citizens by living in a city. And before you're citizens, you don't know you're not civically minded enough to actually understand how to become a citizen. So he has the legislator is some external figure who comes in and sets it up for you a bit. So that's how he breaks out of that. Okay. And so it seems to me, maybe I'm pushing this a little bit too strongly. I mean, there's other scholars who seem to think, look, the differences aren't so great between Spinoza's texts. Well, there are some differences. What do they amount to? I think there is at least at some level, there's some move to downplay the social contract. And so it seems that the social contract point of view was important for Spinoza to position himself in relation to Hobbes. But in the second text, he's just not talking to Hobbes anymore. And he's much more interested in a systems kind of view. Like, how do you set up a social order so that it sustains itself and generates within it good civically minded subjects who can continue to maintain a good social order? Let me see, what's my next? Yes, so here, how do you lay the foundation of the state which will result in people being guided by affects more advantageous to the Republic? Okay, so I think I'm running a little low on time, so let me try to pull this together. If you remember that our starting point for Spinoza's political theory is that right is coextensive with power, this is kind of interesting because it seems to have the result that, remember, if right's coextensive, because whenever you have some durable political order, then you can, then it counts as having right. But if we start to think not in terms of what could people agree to, but what social order could be sort of self-sustaining, you start to imagine that quite a lot of different social orders could count as being fully rightful. And indeed, Spinoza thinks you can have a self-sustaining monarchy or a self-sustaining aristocracy, and they count as fully sort of endowed with right. He also, more troublingly, seems to think that if you could actually generate a social order where everybody's kind of really servile, and you somehow make it sustainable so it doesn't break down, where people are really servile and I don't know if I've got the quote here, let me see, have a lack of spirit, then you might actually say that order, as a self-sustaining order of slaves, that also seems to have right. And I think he sort of comes to this in the political treatise, and he says, look, you could have that. You could have a fully rightful order, which is a slave state. And we're going to say that that's bad. We're going to say that's bad. He's going to say he doesn't like that. And he's saying when you could have something, a piece of a commonwealth depends on subjects' lack of spirit, so they're led like sheep, only know how to be slaves. That could work. We're going to rule it out, not because people couldn't agree to it, because we just said that people could generate that kind of servility in people. It's possible. The thing we're going to rule it out is not by saying whether people could agree with it. It's by more substantively saying, look, Spinoza has this model of human flourishing, and he thinks that, living in a really servile way is not a human flourishing life. We want one where people develop their mind and develop their intellect. So he's just kind of almost stipulatively going to say, okay, all of this political theory about rightful orders, it's going to, something which is going to collapse soon is lacking in right. But kind of what we want to say in like unappealing social orders, they have right, but we're going to rule them out for a different reason, which is Spinoza's written this whole big book about how it's really important for people's individual happiness and blessedness that they develop their mind. So we're just going to say they're no good for that reason. Okay, so where do we end up with this? I think it turns out, for the most part, that Spinoza, particularly compared to his age, he thinks that a well-governed, lawful republic with freedom of thought and expression is going to end up being more stable and sustainable than others. He allows it. It's kind of conceivable you could have a slave state, but he's going to say we're just going to say that's not what we're interested in, because we do also care about human flourishing. And it so happens, even when he talks about monarchy, he kind of says, well, look, good monarchy is one where you have, this seems to tend to push in this direction of somehow more participatory. A good monarchy is going to be one where the king doesn't do much, and actually you basically have things run by a big assembly of wise, a big quasi-democratic assembly. He's not a modern thinker in some ways. He's also happy with aristocracy. Like it would be a bad aristocracy if you only had three like inbred aristocrats in charge. But so long as you have a robust and intelligent aristocracy, aristocratic class, it's fine to have an aristocracy, even if the aristocratic class is only 1/50th of the population. So he's not a modern thinker who he has more sympathy for democracy than just about anybody else in this early modern period, but he's not a modern thinker in that sense. But I think what I end up with from his work is this interesting, if I had to contrast it, like between a social contract approach, which asks what could we agree to, versus maybe a Machiavellian approach, which is what works. And that doesn't mean we're not caring about virtue. We want to know about what works maintaining virtue, but what works is the question rather than what could we agree to. And I see Spinoza in his two texts shifting between the two and moving maybe towards this Machiavellian what works question in the second text. Okay, let me just round off. I'm quite interested in this particular feature of Spinoza's thought, this idea that the person depends on the society in which they exist. It seems that some, maybe not all, but some social contract theory is what I'd classify as a liberal individualism, because it understands the legitimacy of society in terms of what people individually can accept or rationally endorse or something like that. But this seems to, like, what people accept, your actual preferences are the product of the society that you're in. And so, of course, if any functional system is going to have have some alignment with what people want and how the society runs. But it seems that you can't take what people want as foundational. That's the kind of interesting lesson I take from this Spinoza's political theory, that because we want to think about, try to look at functional political systems and compare them without thinking of asking what people want as somehow this foundational moment that helps us to decide whether something's legitimate or not. So that's kind of that's what I find very interesting in my own work. I'm sort of trying to work out how to communicate to contemporary political theorists and not just historians of political thought. I'm really interested, particularly in contemporary democratic theory. You're always trying to tie things one way or another back to what people's actual preferences are. And sure, that's like critically important for democratic theory. But if you know that people's preferences are also generated by the social order they live in, there's some weird sort of circularity of taking those preferences as foundational. And that's what I'm currently interested in. So thanks a lot, everybody. That's my account of Spinoza and social contract theory. I welcome your comments.
It's wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Sandra, for being willing to go outside the work that you published previously and sharing with us that wonderful sort of menu of ideas that we can now feast on in the question time. I'm wondering if you might unshare your screen, if that would be
unshare. Sure, no problem.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
Okay.
And it also seems that I've disappeared. Oh no, there I am.
There you are.
Now, just for people who are not familiar with these seminars, our usual practice is to ask questions by just writing a very brief version of the question in the chat. And then I'll call upon people to ask their questions in the order that you appear in the chat. And just while people are taking a moment to compose questions, I might jump in with one of my own to kick things off, if I may, Sandra. It's not a question about the core of what you were saying. I'm hoping that over the question time we will unpick the sort of the central thesis. It's more a sort of peripheral point that got me thinking about a third of the way through the talk when you were
Yeah.
discussing the Spinoza's understanding of rights, which was
Yeah.
both new and fascinating to me. And I was trying to think how on earth that works, and specifically how the temporality of rights for Spinoza works, in the sense that is it the case that for Spinoza, I never have the right to do something until I finish doing it, because I don't know until I finish doing it that I was able to do it. So, for example, if I'm 2/3 of the way through something and then I have a heart attack and die, or I find myself for some other reason incapable of completing the task, de facto, I did not have the right to do it because I didn't have the power to do it and I didn't finish doing it. And if that's the case, then it would seem that I can never say I have the right to anything. I can only ever say I had the right, looking back, having completed whatever it was, having had demonstrated that I have the power to do it. I now know that I had the right to do it. But until it was over and done with, I couldn't be sure that I had the right. So are rights only ever retrospective for Spinoza? Is what
Yeah,
I'm
look, I think that's nice actually, and so so I think I've got maybe two different angles of that. I think in one sense he's really quite. Sometimes when he's saying about whether you've got the right and power, he's like, if you didn't do it, that shows that you didn't have the power. You might have thought you were going to, but you might have been wrong, right? So there is that weird, real flattening of sometimes in his metaphysics, sometimes it says all power is fully actualized. But it's when it's fully actualized, it becomes almost like it's almost like just emptying out the concept, because like the whole point of the concept normally is to have something that you can say prospectively. And so it seems to me that there's a bit of a double track going on here. So it seems like and I sort of signaled that a bit, that like on the one hand, I think he does quite like that idea. It's like if you say, somebody like, particularly at the ethical level, it's like, why did you do that dumb thing? It's like, well, nature's power didn't suffice for me to, like, I didn't, like, it turns out I didn't have the power. I thought I was going to, but I didn't, right? And so, what can I say, right? And so he's got this very, like, quite strong anti-blame kind of thing going on in ethics. It's like what is, and nature is perfect and everything is as it is. Some pots made unto honor and some unto dishonor and so on. But at the same time, of course, that would be a curious view, but I think that is his view. But for practical purposes, I suppose we do like say whether we can sort of say prospectively. And I think the way to think about this is that it's actually something a little bit similar when Hobbes talks about power, not about right. But you can, as a kind of convenient shorthand, say, I have the power to do something, because on the basis of your knowledge of how the world works, you're pretty sure it's going to work out. And then, but then if it turns out, and so you can say, I think you can say I've got the power to do it, because for all you know, you do. If there's not some reason that shows you that obviously you don't, like, then you say, okay, I've got the power to do it. Then you can say, I've got the right to do it. But then afterwards, when it turns out you couldn't do it, you'd be like, oh, I was wrong, right? So there's this sort of, so I think it does have that curious feature, but when you start to use it in political theory, you do start to say what rights a commonwealth has, more than just what happens, and there's right for what happens, there's not right for what not happens. It means paying very close attention to how things tend to go. And for instance, when you keep on having like I don't know, peasant revolts, you can't say, naughty peasants, you don't have the right to revolt because I am a rightful ruler. You got to say, well, if I'm keeping on having peasant revolts and if I'm not able to suppress them, I can't just say I have right and you are naughty. You could sort of try to say that to try to get some effect, but what you got to understand is the extent of your right depends on just how much you can actually do it. And this has this interesting result for thinking about rebellions. And this is another reason why the Marxists like it a bit. It's like, well, of course, like Hobbes, he says a ruler is absolute and you shouldn't rebel against them. But if you do rebel and you succeed, then you have the right and power to do so.
Yeah, wonderful. Sounds ever so slightly like he's trying to have his cake and eat it, but I see why he has these two separate tracks going. That's really helpful. Thank you. Betian has a question in the comments, and after that, Karen will also have a question. So Betian first, please.
So should I read the thing in the comment, or do you want to speak to it, Betian?
Betian, I think, will unmute himself and then ask Viva Voce.
Okay, sure.
Okay, Sandra, first of all, thanks so much for this, because I really learned a lot from you. And well, I'm still a beginner as far as Spinoza is concerned. So I would be very happy if you could help me with some of the issues that I'm struggling with a bit. So so you have been talking also about, for instance, a slave state as a possibility, of course, but what I think is very difficult, at least I find it very difficult, is his notion of reason. And also as a way of, making your power and hence also your right larger. So he also writes, for instance, in TTP that individual human beings, when they act reasonably, then they have more right to a certain extent, or perhaps even to a large extent. And also when you go to the state, and then also larger groups of persons, also when they act reasonably, they are more powerful, and also they have more freedom. So, but it still is a difficult thing, I think, to grasp. And well, you touched upon this in the lecture, I think, a bit, but not really systematically done so. But of course, that's a big issue as well. But perhaps you can say something about that.
Thank you. I think it's true that this is a central sort of question, which I didn't really talk about. And I should just to sort of connect across from Chris's question, I think Spinoza is like this wonderful systematic thinker, but quite sort of tricky, and also seems to have a lot of have your cake and eat it too moments. I think that's sometimes why people get so enthusiastic. And so, one has to really sit and pin down and see when it is one of these cake and eat it moments, and see if we can actually make sense of it. Now, it's true that it's central to both the ethics and the politics that there's somehow that increasing your reason is supposed to increase your power. And like on the one hand, you can kind of see that, right? And so even in the ethics, to give an example to make that plausible, if you contrast between somebody who has a really foul temper and somebody who's pretty serene, or somebody who's like subject to any kind of passions, like if you're going to get you're going to do all sorts of dumb stuff, right? You're going to get pushed around by circumstances and not be able to just stay the course if you're swayed by the passion. That's one of the central sort of ideas he has. So on the one hand, you can kind of see it, but even at the ethical level, you're like, wait a minute, I can kind of see it. But also there's plenty of really angry jerks who get everything that they want. And so don't they have more power, even though they're less rational in this Spinoza sense? And I think this is a puzzle that I've tried to look at, in my other work. And I think, in brief, there's this thing which is just at the edge of what I've spoken about today. Maybe I can't explain fully now. That there's one, I sort of differentiate in my book between saying something having power in general versus acting from its own power, right? And so say, I don't know, if you're when I was writing my book, I think Harvey Weinstein, that whole thing had just hit. And it's like, this man is incredibly, causes a lot of effects, right, shall we say? So he's very powerful in that sense, causes a lot of effects in the world. But he's not like this sort of rationality in Spinoza is associated with self-control and understanding and not being pushed around with the passion. So here's a guy who's causing a lot of effects in the world, but not very powerful or rational in the Spinoza sense. And there's this distinction he makes between being in control, like acting through your own nature or acting through another. And so I think sometimes you might say that, if you are, there's one sense of power, which is kind of a bit more the Hobbesian one, which is producing lots of effects. But you might, the Harvey Weinstein, depends on all sorts of he's quite lacking in self-control in this sort of ethical sense, but he's causing a lot of effects, but he's not sort of this rational sage. And so the same thing can happen for politics as well. So Spinoza has lots of stuff where he says, look, the more rational state is going to be more powerful. And you can see what he's got in mind. Like if you're making lots of dumb decisions or you're provoking wars with people all the time, you're not going to go very well. So you can kind of see it. But at the same time, you could be I don't know, if you're a big, this is one example I've used, is I think Spinoza also talks about if you are a regime that's being supported by some sort of geopolitical, some big actor somewhere else, you can get away with doing all sorts of stuff, which is not through your being so well self-regulated. So I think this is one of the things that's so tantalizing, that Spinoza seems to say virtuous, freedom, powerful, all goes together, right? But I think one has to differentiate a little bit. And so where does that leave us in terms of my talk? Because I didn't really incorporate that into my talk. I think that you're going to have the right coextensive with power really is including, if you do, including this not sort of through one's own power, one's own rationale. It's going to include whatever you achieve is going to be, you've got the right coextensive with your power. But as I tried to say at the end, he's interested in those ones where it's the more the ones sort of more the way in which they're powerful is through being well self-regulated, rather than the way in which they're powerful being because, I don't know, they've got friends with big guns or something like that. I mean, I think I've laboured this a bit in my book, and whether you find it satisfactory or not, that might be somewhere you can see what I've made of it and see what. Okay. And this is actually something I've been maybe more interested, I'd say, than other people in the scholarship. I think a lot of people particularly have, from one reason or another, been looking for Spinoza, early champion of democracy, right equals power equals reason equals freedom, everything aligns. And so I spent quite a long time really trying to hammer how these things could go apart. But I kind of didn't have that in the center of my mind for this talk. Yeah.
Perhaps one small follow-up, Chris, if that's all right, and also perhaps to the second point that I wanted to ask you. But so what I've also been wondering, well, how and this is in regard to the first question still. So how well religious the theory is. So when he talks about your natural right, and you have been talking about fish, etc. So God made these larger fish have teeth, etc., and all the capabilities to catch these smaller fish. And he has made, for instance, human beings. He endowed them with some kind of reasoning faculty. So you could also perhaps raise the question: how religious is the theory, and does he have a certain idea about this is how human beings should be? But and perhaps that is a nice bridge to the second part that I wanted to raise. This idea of extending the theory to. So I was really intrigued because you were introduced by Chris as also interested in indigenous philosophy, etc. So. And I've also been reading a bit about that as well. And they have this idea of interconnectedness. And I think that's also in Spinoza. And so Spinoza is also embraced, but perhaps by many people, but he's also embraced, at least by environmentally philosophy, etc. So,
so there's two classic points. So there's two classic sort of locations to think about this, right? And so one is Arne Næss. Arne Næss is a Norwegian from the 1970s who wrote a lot on Spinoza, on environmentalism, and on Buddhism. And he thought Spinoza was the big guy for deep ecology, that, we're all part of nature. Spinoza's got this phrase, we're not a kingdom in a kingdom, we're just part of nature. And Arne Næss thought that this was just sort of, we have to appreciate our interconnection with everything and therefore sort of care about and protect things. And it's interesting because in some ways there's a lot of ground for that. But in other ways, this is something that other people have said is just a fundamental misreading of Spinoza. And I don't think it's a fundamental misreading, but what's interesting is that if you look at the postscript to part 1 of book 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza says, the world is not made for human purposes. It's not made for any purposes. So everything is perfect. Nothing is made for any purpose whatsoever. And so what you say, why are things ugly? Why do things stink? And it's like, because everything exists as it is, and because all of these, and so it is. I mean, there's been this oscillation over time between saying, is Spinoza an atheist or a pantheist? Well, he's kind of both, but to the extent that he's a pantheist, it's a very idiosyncratic one because he really insists there is no purpose. So it's so he thinks it's really everything is as it is, as it is, as it is. And if it's destroyed, that's also how it is. If it's not destroyed, that's also how it is. And there's no point of, like, in some way, everything, whatever actually happens comes from the perfection of nature, and there's no complaining about it. So in one way, that kind of kicks the environmentalist thing out of the water because, if in point of fact we destroy all of nature and implode this galaxy, it's like, okay, that also happened. Perfection of God's nature, super, right? So, but on the other hand, I think there's something to it because, of course, a lot of the focus for Spinoza is thinking of, God might be indifferent, but we're certainly not indifferent. We are certainly not indifferent. And I think this sort of trope of we are part of nature refuses human exceptionalism in quite an interesting and strong way. And so that leads to thinking about, just as how I'm talking about thinking about political systems in terms of how can you reach some point of sustainable self-regulation of a political system. That also could be extended to in a more environmental direction. That's not Spinoza himself doesn't push it that way, but he really does insist that on this sort of against human exceptionalism. So I think there's interesting, and so yes, so he says, so he's happy to say, right and power. For he gives examples of the big fish eating the little ones, but he also gives the example of the certain little fish getting away from the big ones or whatever, right? But I think he tends not to pursue that quite so much because I think the use of the language of rights is in part a strategic attempt to respond to the discourse that he's dealing with, right? So, why use the language of rights at all? Because everybody else is using the language of rights. So let me try to deflate it, right? So I think that's and so he can use it for animals, but I think when outside of the political tracks, he doesn't tend to use the word right so much because it's just not who he's conversing with. He'll just talk about power and reality and things like that.
Well, thank you so much, Sandra. Karen, you've been waiting very patiently since putting your hand up. Can I invite you now to ask your question, please?
Thanks. My internet seems to be a bit unstable, so I might disappear. But first of all, a tiny question. I was wondering when you talked about TTP and Spinoza said that man wouldn't put up with it, men wouldn't put up with it. I just wondered whether that was homo or humanitas.
All right. Okay. So two things. So number one, so I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be, just trying to think what the quote was that you're referring to. I don't think he uses the word humanitas, so he uses homo all the time. And so there's two things to say about that. On the one hand, just as you've got humans and humans versus nature, there's not a big divide. Similarly, my internet's unstable too. Human versus nature, not a big divide. Also, man versus woman, there's not some big divide. But he thinks that the thing that he died writing was explaining why women don't get to be citizens. So he thought that in point of fact, their power is always less, right? So it's actually some people say he died on the page, writing about this.
The other comment really is it all sounds incredibly stoic. Nature, nature has laws.
Yep.
And you can't do anything that's against the laws of nature. And in the individual, reason has to govern the passions. I mean, if you don't understand how things go, then you'll just or rather the passions.
Yeah, look, I should speak
so far as they get in the way of reason, sort of lead you down the similar state. It's the ruler who doesn't the nature of humanity won't rule well. But you sort of made some comment about whether I would think this was social contract. Actually, I think Catherine Macaulay is on exactly the same page. And in a way, she criticizes Hobbes. Okay, Hobbes says that man is not social by nature. And Macaulay argues, no. What Hobbes shows is that it's rational to accept a sovereign. At least it's rational up to a certain point. And so, in fact, we are social by nature, insofar as we're rational, and insofar as that tells us that in order for us to live well, we need to be governed by a reasonable law. So I think they're both highly stoic. Well, they're certainly, Macaulay's highly stoic, and they're more or less on the same page.
Yeah, look, so it seems to be like, I suppose I have to talk to you and Jackie more about this to get myself straight on it. Like, I think there is some book that came out a little while ago about Spinoza and Stoicism. And certainly, but there's other folks who talk about him as more of an Epicurean. And so I'm just trying to think through, like, certainly there's a lot of stuff about, the mastery of the passions, right? And, finding your reason. I think there's a few interesting twists on it insofar as he also wants to insist that, insist a little bit more that you can't just decide. You can't just decide to live the life of reason. But I suppose the Stoics probably don't say that either, right? Because they're not silly, right? So there's other moments where he talks. I'm trying to think why he's normally more classified equally much with the Epicureans. He also wants to talk about, the pleasure, like that diverse bodily and other pleasures are. He says it's only a sad and savage superstition that would deny that to us. And so he does not. So that, I suppose that's the way he's like, actually you're trying, like, your goal isn't to all like be these sort of self-reliant, rational things. Like, ideally you have this sort of, flourishing, pleasurable life as well.
But maybe,
I don't know, yes.
Maybe the ancient Stoics and the ancient Epicureans aren't all that far apart from each other, because it's true that the Stoics say, virtue is the highest good, and the Epicureans say, no, pleasure in some sense, or something more physical and natural, that's what we want. But the Epicureans have such a kind of theory about how, the only way really to be sure of living a happy, good life is to sort of respect others and to realise that if you try and dominate others in ways that doesn't recognise their nature, then your life will go badly. So they end up with what we would think of as a very non-Epicurean kind of.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And yeah, there's a failure I think in the Stoic theory, in some sense, insofar as they want to make virtue good in itself, and then, but the virtuous person the virtuous person doesn't worry about their own pleasure, but they have to worry about the pleasure and pain of others. Otherwise, none of the things we think of as virtue. So, in a way, I mean, maybe there's some technical sense in which it's more Epicurean, but it also sounds incredibly Stoic.
Yeah, well, it's all in that mix, though. It's in that whole wash of that kind of theorizing. And I suppose one thing which I suppose, one of the, not just in the ethics, but also in the politics, because he quotes Seneca, right? He's reading all of these, these folks as well about, thinking about tyranny and this sort of thing. So I'm not so good on parsing all of those differences, but it's certainly all in that kind of wash of those kind of practices of thinking about one's reason and one's passions and how that, trying to shape that to live the good life. And so it's funny because sometimes when you're not much of a historian like me, you come to Spinoza and you're like, wow, what an unusual thinker. But I gather that, on 20 different levels, there's just it's just really quite enmeshed with a whole lot of other things. Apparently there were a lot of other Hobbesians in the Dutch, similar to Spinoza, who maybe just a little bit less theoretically sort of fancy, who took Hobbesian ideas but rendered them in de facto terms rather than in juridical terms. And apparently that wasn't just Spinoza. And so, and then also on the ethical theory, it's like, wow, just thinking of people just having to struggle with, having to live with their passions and things like this. It's like everybody's doing that kind of thing. And so there are some quite distinctive things, and there's something boldly systematizing about it. But yes, I think so. It's in this.
But you mentioned Seneca. You mentioned Seneca. You're quoting Seneca. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think one of the signs that these seminars have gone really well is that I feel very reluctant to draw them to a close. And I have a whole string of questions still to ask. And that is very much the case on this occasion. We could go on for a long time, but I need to respect the finishing time for this seminar. So I need to draw things to a close. Just before we thank our speaker for the evening, can I just please share news of the upcoming seminars? We've got 2 seminars on the horizon. On the 16th of October, John Holmwood is going to speak on modern capitalism as colonialism, rethinking C.B. Macpherson's theory of possessive individualism. And then on the 31st of October, Timothy Howells is going to address the title, The Significance of the Individual and the Concept of the Social in the Work of Carl Schmitt. So if either of those subjects interest you, there's a little link there on the screen where you can find more details and abstracts and sign up for the Zoom links. And it just remains for me to give a very, very warm thanks to our speaker for this evening, Dr. Sandra Field. Thank you ever so much for a wonderful paper and just the richness with which you engaged with the questions. You've really given us a great deal to think about, and we're very grateful indeed. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.